I will trade 5 years of my labor, the absolute deed to my own freedom, and this silver watch for exactly $12. And I need the money right this very second. Valerie stood on the splintered wooden boards of the sun-baked auction block, her voice cracking through the stifling afternoon heat. She was a woman built like a mountain, a towering figure of immense physical power. Beneath the frayed edges of her faded red cotton dress, thick, heavily developed muscles corded along her shoulders and biceps. Her thighs, solid and unyielding, braced against the heavy oak planks as she held her grandfather's tarnished pocket watch high into the blinding sunlight. Dust coated her boots. Sweat tracked through the grime on her resolute, beautifully strong face. She did not look like a woman who needed pity. She looked like a warrior who could break a man in two with her bare hands, yet her hands trembled violently as she held out the silver timepiece. Below her, the men of the town square laughed. They pointed at her massive frame, mocking the sheer size of her, throwing cruel insults about a woman who looked more like a lumberjack than a lady. What those cruel townsfolk saw that afternoon was just a desperate, broken giant of a woman begging for scraps. But the truth was far more complicated than anyone imagined. Stay with me until the end of this memory, and perhaps leave a word in the comments about where you are watching from, so I can see how far this story travels. You might just find that the strongest hearts are often the ones most heavily scarred. Valerie did not care about their laughter. She did not care about her bruised dignity. She only cared about the small, feverish bundle resting in the shade of a nearby wagon. Her young son, Leo, was burning alive from the inside out with a chest sickness that rattled fiercely with every labored breath. The apothecary across the street possessed the medicine required to break the fever, but the cruel merchant demanded $12. Valerie had absolutely nothing left. She had sold her horse, her winter coat, and her wedding ring. Now she was offering the very muscles on her bones and the remaining years of her youth. I am a strong worker, Valerie pleaded, her voice dropping to a desperate, raspy pitch. I can plow a field faster than your best ox. I can fell timber. I can build fences. Just give me $12. Please. The auctioneer, a sweaty man with a cruel smile, merely spat tobacco juice onto the dirt. A rancher in the front row sneered, kicking a boot against the platform. I have no use for a freak of nature in my house, the rancher mocked loudly. Maybe the circus will give you $1, giant. Valerie felt the crushing weight of utter despair pressing down upon her broad shoulders. She tightened her thick, calloused fingers around the silver watch. A tear, hot and heavy, broke free and rolled down her dust-covered cheek. Her immense physical strength, the very muscle that had kept her alive through countless brutal winters, was entirely useless against a microscopic fever. She would tear down the entire town with her bare hands if it would save her boy, but violence could not purchase medicine. Then the laughter abruptly ceased. The heavy, rhythmic thud of solid boot steps echoed through the sudden silence of the square. The crowd parted like water rushing around a massive boulder. A man stepped forward into the harsh light. He was a towering, silent fortress of a man. His broad shoulders stretched the fabric of a worn, dust-covered work shirt. Suspenders dug into his powerful chest, and a weathered cowboy hat cast a deep shadow over sharp, observant eyes. His skin was bronzed and heavily lined by the brutal frontier sun. He possessed a rugged, unkempt, thick beard and shoulder-length brown hair that spoke of long, lonely months spent out on the high plains. He did not swagger. He did not boast. He merely stood there, radiating a quiet, dangerous kind of protective authority. $100, the man rumbled, his voice dark and heavy as distant thunder. The auctioneer blinked, his mouth dropping open. The mocking townsfolk stood frozen in absolute shock. Gideon reached into his leather vest and produced a thick fold of banknotes. He did not look at the auctioneer. He did not look at the sneering ranchers. He kept his sharp, observant eyes locked solely on Valerie. He stepped up to the edge of the wooden platform, extending his large, calloused hand toward the apothecary who had stepped out onto the porch. $12 goes to the merchant for the boy's medicine, Gideon commanded quietly, his tone leaving absolutely no room for debate. The rest goes into the woman's pocket. Valerie stared down at this towering stranger, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs. She was entirely unaccustomed to anyone looking at her with anything other than fear or disgust. Yet this weathered cattle foreman looked at her wildly muscular frame and dust-streaked face with profound, unwavering respect. He handed the money over, then turned back to Valerie, giving a slow, definitive nod toward the wagon where her sick child rested. Valerie scrambled off the platform, her mind racing with a chaotic mixture of desperate relief and sudden, chilling terror. As she gathered her feverish son into her massive arms and followed the silent protector toward his waiting carriage, a heavy knot twisted deep inside her stomach. No man on the frontier gave away $100 purely out of the goodness of his heart. Why did this silent, towering stranger pay a fortune for a woman he did not know? And what dark, terrible price would he demand in return when they finally reached his isolated ranch? The carriage wheels ground against the dry earth, churning up thick clouds of prairie dust as they traveled further from the cruel town. Valerie sat rigidly in the wooden passenger seat, her massive arms wrapped fiercely around her sleeping son. The medicine the towering stranger had purchased was already working. Little Leo breathed much easier now, the terrifying rattle in his chest fading into a quiet, rhythmic slumber. Yet Valerie could not find any peace. She kept her broad shoulders tense, her powerful thighs braced against the floorboards, entirely prepared to leap from the moving wagon if the silent man beside her made a sudden threat. Her thick, heavily developed muscles, forged through years of relentless survival, felt entirely useless against the terrifying vulnerability of sudden hope. Gideon did no such thing. He held the leather reins with steady, calloused hands, keeping his gaze fixed upon the distant horizon. He did not ask her questions. He did not demand gratitude. He simply drove the team of draft horses with a quiet, unwavering competence. The harsh, unforgiving prairie slowly gave way to rolling hills of golden grass, painted in the soft, fading light of the late afternoon. They arrived at a sprawling ranch nestled against the foothills of a jagged mountain range. The property was beautiful, yet it possessed a profound, aching emptiness. Sturdy wooden fences stretched for miles across the valley. A massive timber barn stood proudly against the wind. The main house, built of thick pine logs and river stone, looked built to withstand the end of the world. But there were no voices. There was no laughter. It was a beautiful fortress built for a solitary ghost. Gideon halted the wagon near the front porch. He climbed down slowly, his massive frame moving with heavy, deliberate grace. "Take the boy inside," Gideon rumbled, gesturing toward the heavy wooden door with his weathered hat. "The front bedroom belongs to you. I sent word to the county doctor before I bought your watch. He will arrive by nightfall to check the child." Valerie froze, her heavy work boots planted firmly in the dirt. She tightened her grip on Leo, her sharp eyes scanning the rugged cowboy for any sign of deception. Men did not simply give away fortunes and bedrooms to giant, desperate women without expecting a heavy, humiliating toll in return. She squared her massive shoulders, letting her intimidating height mirror his own. She was a woman built like a titan, yet she felt a strange flicker of uncertainty standing before the quiet honor of this silent protector. "What do you want from me?" Valerie demanded softly, her voice thick with guarded suspicion. "You purchased 5 years of my labor. Tell me what my duties are. I will break wild horses. I will chop winter firewood. I will plow the fields until my hands bleed. Just tell me what you demand of me." Gideon stopped upon the porch steps. He turned around slowly. His weathered, sun-bronzed face remained entirely stoic, but a flicker of deep sadness passed behind his observant eyes. He looked at her heavily muscled arms, at the frayed edges of her faded red dress, and at the fierce, defensive posture of a mother who had spent her entire life expecting a cruel blow. "I did not purchase you," Gideon murmured, his voice rumbling low like a gentle hearth fire. "No human being belongs on an auction block. You are not my servant. You are not my property. You are a guest in my home. When the boy recovers, if you wish to earn your keep, you will work the ranch alongside me as an equal hand. You will receive a fair wage for a fair day of labor." Valerie stared at him, completely stunned. The rigid tension holding her massive frame together began to tremble. She had prepared herself for cruelty. She had prepared herself for exhausting servitude. She had never prepared herself for dignity. "Why?" Valerie whispered, her voice catching painfully in her throat. "Because the world is hard enough," Gideon replied quietly, turning back toward the door. "We do not need to make it harder for each other." The county doctor, a brisk man carrying a black leather bag, arrived just as the sun dipped behind the jagged peaks. He examined the sleeping boy and confirmed the medicine had done its vital work. Leo would sleep through the night and wake with a clear chest. That evening, Valerie walked softly through the silent house. The heavy timber walls radiated a surprising warmth. For the first time in many years, Valerie felt a strange, delicate seed of trust taking root in her battered heart. She watched Gideon from the kitchen threshold as he quietly stoked the living room fire. His broad back was turned to her, his posture heavy with an unspoken sorrow. Gideon noticed her standing there and offered a brief, respectful nod. He walked her through the long corridor of the house, showing her the pantry and the washroom. He moved with deliberate respect, ensuring she never felt trapped in the narrow space. However, at the very end of the hallway, the atmosphere abruptly changed. Gideon stopped before a heavy, dark oak door. A heavy iron lock secured the frame. The quiet warmth radiating from the stoic rancher suddenly vanished, replaced by a cold, impenetrable wall of grief. He placed a large, calloused hand flat against the dark wood. "You have free reign of this entire property," Gideon stated, his voice suddenly sharp and unyielding. "But you must never open this door. You must never ask what is behind it. Do we understand each other?" Valerie nodded slowly, a chill running down her spine. As Gideon walked away, retreating into the shadows of the lonely house, Valerie remained standing before the locked room. What was behind the heavy oak door at the end of the hall that Gideon strictly forbade anyone from opening? The golden light of dawn broke over the jagged mountain ridge, spilling through the glass window of the front bedroom and casting long, warm shadows across the wooden floor. Valerie woke to absolute quiet, a luxury she had not experienced in months. She rolled out of bed, her massive, heavily muscled frame moving with a swift, panther-like grace that completely defied her intimidating stature. She stretched her broad shoulders, the thick cords of muscle flexing beneath her simple linen shirt. Her first instinct was survival, a sharp, ingrained reflex to check for enemies or danger. But the quiet stillness of the ranch offered only the gentle whistling of the morning wind. She walked down the long timber hallway, carefully avoiding the heavy oak door at the end with its forbidding iron lock. The memory of Gideon warning her away from that shadowed room lingered in her mind like a cold shadow, yet her practical nature quickly pushed the curiosity aside. She had a roof over her head, medicine in her son's belly, and a debt to work off. In the sunlit kitchen, she found Leo sitting up against a pile of pillows, his cheeks finely flushed with natural warmth rather than feverish heat. He smiled broadly, his small hands clutching a piece of dry bread that had been left on the wooden table. Gideon was already outside. Through the kitchen window, Valerie watched the towering cattle foreman working near the corrals. He was wrestling a massive, half-broken bay gelding, using his tremendous upper body strength to calm the wild animal. Yet even from a distance, Valerie could see that the horse was fighting a panic that Gideon was struggling to control. The fence post was splintering under the pressure, and if the heavy timber gave way, the frightened animal would bolt directly into the path of a steep ravine. Without a moment of hesitation, Valerie strode out the back door, her heavy boots crunched against the gravel. She stepped into the corral, her towering, heavily muscled frame immediately drawing the frantic gaze of the horse. "Step back, Valerie," Gideon shouted, his deep voice carrying an unusual edge of urgent panic as he tried to keep his grip on the hemp lead rope. "This animal is wild. He will trample you." Valerie did not retreat. She possessed a rare instinctive understanding of broken things, having lived a life of brutal hardship herself. She did not approach the horse with a weapon or a shout. Instead, she moved with deliberate, heavy steps, lowering her massive shoulders to appear less threatening while using her imposing physical presence to block the animal's escape path toward the ravine. The horse neighed wildly, rearing up on its hind legs and thrashing its powerful forelegs in the air. Before Gideon could leap forward to shield her, Valerie moved with breathtaking speed. Her thick, well-developed thighs braced against the dirt. She lunged forward, her massive arms wrapping securely around the plunging neck of the giant animal. Her sheer, monumental muscle power met the brute strength of the horse head-on. The ground shuddered beneath them. For 3 agonizing seconds, the woman and the beast stood locked in a primal struggle of raw power. Valerie did not try to break the animal with cruelty. She simply anchored it to the earth with her own unyielding physical force, whispering deep, soothing sounds into the trembling creature's ear until the frantic wildness drained from its dark eyes. The horse dropped heavily back onto all 4 hooves, blowing a hot cloud of breath into the morning air, entirely subdued. Silence settled over the corral, broken only by the whistling wind and the sound of heavy breathing. Gideon stood frozen a few feet away, his thick beard slightly parted in sheer astonishment. He looked from the calm horse down to Valerie. He had spent his entire life surrounded by rough frontier men who boasted of their physical prowess, yet he had never witnessed a human being tame a panicked stallion with pure, compassionate strength. There was no fear in her eyes, only a profound, grounded resilience. Slowly, Gideon lowered the lead rope. A rare, genuine flicker of deep admiration softened the hard, withered lines of his face. He stepped closer, his broad shoulders casting a warm shadow over her. "You could have been killed," Gideon murmured, his voice uncharacteristically rough, carrying an undercurrent of raw emotion he was desperately trying to conceal. "I have survived worse than a frightened horse," Valerie replied quietly, holding his intense, observant gaze without flinching. She did not boast, nor did she cower. She simply stood tall, her massive frame radiating in quiet dignity that demanded absolute respect. Gideon reached out, his large, calloused hand hovering near her shoulder before dropping back to his side, restrained by his habitual caution. Yet the air between them had fundamentally shifted. The initial curiosity had burned away, replaced by a profound mutual awe that neither of them knew how to name. That afternoon, as they worked side by side mending the broken fence line, the local county doctor arrived unexpectedly, bearing a heavy medical ledger and a grim expression. He pulled Gideon aside near the barn, speaking in hushed, urgent tones. Valerie watched from a distance, her sharp eyes catching the way Gideon's powerful frame stiffened like stone. The doctor had discovered something vital about Leo's lingering recovery. The fever had broken, but a rare underlying heart weakness required a specific expensive tonic that could only be brewed using a rare alpine herb. And the only person in the valley who possessed that herb was a reclusive apothecary 3 days' ride into the jagged mountains. A man who refused to trade with strangers unless paid in absolute gold. Valerie felt her stomach drop. She had traded everything she owned just to save her son's life once. Now, she faced a mountain she could not climb with muscle alone. What the doctor did not know was that Gideon possessed a small chest of gold hidden away behind the heavy, locked oak door at the end of the hall. As the sun began to set, casting long, bloody streaks across the western sky, Valerie watched Gideon walk back toward the house with a heavy, troubled stride, directly toward the forbidden room. What secret lay waiting behind that heavy timber door, and would Gideon finally open it to save her child? The heavy iron key grated harshly inside the ancient lock. Valerie stood a few paces behind Gideon, the dim light of the hallway casting long, dramatic shadows across her broad, heavily muscled shoulders. She watched the towering cattle foreman hesitate. His massive frame, usually so unshakable and absolute in its rigid strength, trembled slightly as he pushed the heavy oak timber inward. The dry hinges protested with a mournful groan. The scent of dried lavender, crushed sage, and ancient dust drifted out into the corridor, carrying the unbearable weight of a life long extinguished. Gideon did not turn around. He simply pushed the door wider, offering a silent invitation for Valerie to cross the forbidden threshold. She stepped into the shadowed room, her heavy leather boots making absolutely no sound upon the thick woven rugs. It was a beautiful, tragic sanctuary preserved perfectly in time. Glass jars lined wooden shelves against the far wall, filled with dried roots, pressed flowers, and rare alpine herbs. A delicate rocking chair sat motionless beside a dusty window, bathed in the pale moonlight. A small, handcrafted wooden cradle rested in the corner, meticulously carved with running horses, yet entirely empty. Valerie felt the air violently leave her lungs. Her own maternal heart ached with immediate, profound understanding. She looked at the giant stoic protector standing amidst the delicate ghosts of his past. Gideon walked heavily toward the shelves. His calloused fingers, so accustomed to breaking wild horses and felling rough timber, gently traced the rim of a sealed glass jar. "My wife was a healer," Gideon murmured, his deep voice thick with an ancient, unhealed sorrow that resonated through the quiet room. She spent her life gathering remedies from the high ridges. 3 years ago, a winter fever swept through this valley. I rode for 3 days through a blinding blizzard to find a doctor. By the time I returned with help, I had lost them both. He lifted a small bundle wrapped in faded oilcloth from the uppermost shelf. He turned to face Valerie, his sharp, observant eyes glistening with unshed tears in the dim light. "The doctor told me what your boy needs," Gideon continued, stepping closer to hand her the precious bundle. "I do not need to buy it with gold. She gathered this alpine root before the frost took her. It has sat in this dark room waiting for a purpose. We will brew it tonight." Valerie accepted the fragile package with her massive, incredibly strong hands. She looked down at the dried herbs, then up at the rugged, weathered face of the man who was offering her the salvation he could not give his own family. The profound admiration she felt for his physical capability cracked wide open, revealing a raw, beautiful vulnerability she had never expected to find in a frontier rancher. They moved together into the kitchen, working in quiet harmony to boil the water and steep the bitter medicine. The fire hissed and popped in the iron stove. When the tonic was ready, radiating a sharp, earthy aroma, they carried the steaming wooden cup into the front bedroom. Little Leo was awake, his small chest rising and falling with a shallow, tired rhythm. He did not cry when Gideon knelt beside the bed. The boy looked up at the towering, bearded man with absolute, unwavering trust. Children possess a rare gift for seeing the true worth of a soul, completely bypassing the intimidating armor of a rugged exterior. "Drink this, little man," Gideon whispered, supporting the child with a gentleness that defied his immense size. Leo drank the bitter brew, his small hands resting against the thick, calloused knuckles of the rancher. Valerie sat on the edge of the mattress, her towering frame hovering over them both like a fierce, protective mountain. As Leo settled back against the pillows, his breathing instantly deepening as the potent herb took effect, Valerie reached out. She placed her large, powerful hand gently upon Gideon's broad shoulder. It was a simple gesture, yet the physical contact struck through the quiet room like a lightning bolt. Gideon stiffened, then slowly leaned into her touch, allowing the immense invisible burden he carried to rest upon her formidable strength. They sat in the quiet dimness, two giants broken by the world, sharing a profound moment of unspoken grief and mutual salvation over the bedside of a sleeping child. The night passed in peaceful silence, cementing a fierce attachment between them that went far deeper than mere gratitude. However, the morning sun brought a cold, merciless wind sweeping down from the northern ridges, carrying a danger no alpine herb could cure. Miles away, riding slowly into the bustling center of the cruel frontier town, a man in a black wool coat dismounted outside the sheriff's office. He was a ruthless debt collector from the eastern settlements, a man who possessed a heart made of cold iron and a legal writ stamped with a federal seal. He held a crumpled paper bearing Valerie's name, demanding full payment for the massive debts left behind by her late gambling husband. If the money could not be produced, the writ granted him the legal authority to seize her only living child as indentured property. The collector smiled grimly, showing a row of silver teeth to the town sheriff, demanding to know where the giant woman had gone. A ruthless debt collector from Valerie's past rode into town, carrying a legal writ to claim her son as payment for her late husband's debts. But what would happen when he finally crossed paths with the silent protector of the valley? 3 days after the alpine medicine broke the dangerous fever, the harsh frontier sun baked the muddy streets of the town into hard, cracked ridges. Valerie rode the heavy wooden wagon into the bustling square alongside Gideon. For the very first time in her remarkably difficult life, Valerie did not feel like a hunted animal bracing for a cruel blow. Sitting beside the massive cattle foreman, her towering, heavily muscled frame finally relaxed into the rhythm of the journey. They were simply coming to town to purchase flour, salt, and winter wool. She watched Gideon handle the thick leather reins, his bronzed face entirely calm beneath the wide brim of his weathered hat. The raw, beautiful vulnerability they had shared in the shadowed room of his home had fused into a fierce, unspoken attachment. She trusted this silent protector with her absolute soul. As Gideon hitched the massive draft horses to the post outside the bustling mercantile, a cold, unnatural shadow fell across the wooden boardwalk. The man in the black wool coat stepped out from the narrow alleyway, flanked by two heavily armed deputies. He smiled, a thin, cruel slash across a pale face, revealing those gleaming silver teeth. Valerie, the debt collector, sneered, pulling a thick, folded parchment from his breast pocket. "You are a very difficult woman to track down across this wilderness, but a federal writ of collection does not care about distance." Valerie froze, her heavy work boots firmly planted upon the dusty boards. The terrible, suffocating ghosts of her past crashed down upon her, threatening to destroy her fragile, newfound peace. She recognized the ruthless Eastern man immediately. He had endlessly harassed her late husband, demanding impossible sums of money, and now he had crossed the territory to claim the ultimate payment. "I owe you absolutely nothing," Valerie growled, her voice dropping into a dangerous, gravelly timbre that resonated from deep within her powerful chest. "Your late husband owed the territorial bank $3,000, the collector countered, snapping the heavy parchment open to display the wax stamp. "Since you cannot pay that debt, this federal seal grants me the legal authority to seize any valuable property you possess. That includes the young boy currently resting at this cattle ranch." Gideon moved like a sudden, terrifying avalanche. His towering, wildly muscular frame stepped directly between Valerie and the cruel men. His sharp, observant eyes locked onto the collector with a deadly, quiet fury. He reached toward the heavy iron buckle of his gun belt, entirely ready to tear the town apart timber by timber to protect the woman standing behind him. But Valerie reached out, her thick, calloused hand wrapping firmly around his broad, unshakable shoulder. "No," Valerie murmured, stepping out from behind his massive shadow. "This is my burden. You will not bleed for my past." Gideon looked at her, seeing the fierce, unyielding mountain of a woman who had wrestled a panicked stallion to the earth with pure grace. He nodded slowly. He stepped backward, widening his powerful stance and turning his intimidating glare upon the armed deputies and the gathering townsfolk. He did not fight her battle for her. He simply became an impenetrable, breathing fortress at her back, ensuring absolutely no one would interfere with her dignity. The debt collector laughed, a harsh, mocking sound echoing off the timber buildings. He reached into his coat and drew a heavy iron pistol, aiming it carelessly toward her chest. "Come quietly, giant, or I will put you in the dirt before taking the child anyway," the man threatened. Valerie did not flinch. She moved with a sudden, terrifying speed that entirely defied her massive size. Before the cruel man could pull the heavy trigger, her heavily developed arm shot forward. Her thick fingers clamped around the cold barrel of the pistol with bone-crushing force. She twisted her wrist sharply upward. The iron weapon snapped out of his grip, rendering him completely disarmed in the blink of an eye. With her other hand, Valerie grabbed the thick fabric of his wool coat. She lifted the ruthless debt collector entirely off the wooden boardwalk. Her massive shoulders and corded biceps strained magnificently against the faded fabric of her dress, hoisting the struggling man into the air as if he weighed absolutely nothing at all. The town square fell into a stunned, breathless silence. The deputies took a terrified step backward, completely paralyzed by the sight of the towering woman holding their employer aloft with pure, monumental strength. "You will never touch my son," Valerie commanded, her voice ringing across the silent square with undeniable, absolute authority. "You will never step foot near my family again." She tossed him aside like a broken branch. The collector crashed heavily into the dust, completely humiliated, gasping for breath beneath the harsh frontier sun. Gideon stepped forward, his heart swelling with a profound, overwhelming attachment to this magnificent, unbreakable woman. He placed his calloused hand firmly at the small of her back, a silent declaration to the entire town that she belonged to his protection. The collector scrambled to his feet, his face red with fury and profound embarrassment. He backed away toward the sheriff's office, pointing a trembling finger at the towering couple. "This writ is federal," the humiliated man shouted desperately. "I will ride to the territorial capital. I will return with 20 armed United States marshals, and we will burn your ranch to the ashes to collect what is owed." As the cruel man spurred his horse out of town, the triumphant adrenaline draining from Valerie's blood was quickly replaced by a freezing terror. Gideon possessed a beautiful, peaceful life, and now her past was bringing a small army to destroy it. She looked up at the stoic, bearded man beside her, terrified that her very presence would cost him everything. Would the humiliated collector return with the law, leaving Valerie to make the ultimate sacrifice to spare Gideon's peaceful life? The journey back to the isolated ranch was swallowed by an absolute, heavy silence. The massive draft horses pulled the wagon through the gathering dusk, their steady hoofbeats drumming a mournful rhythm against the hard earth. Valerie sat beside Gideon upon the wooden bench, her broad shoulders tense, staring blankly at the fading purple light on the horizon. The profound victory she had felt in the town square had completely evaporated, replaced by a suffocating blanket of guilt. She had brought a terrible war to the doorstep of a man who only sought the quiet peace of the valley. 20 armed federal marshals would not care about dignity or righteousness. They would bring fire, iron, and blood. Night fell over the frontier, wrapping the sprawling cattle ranch in a blanket of freezing darkness. After putting little Leo to sleep in the warmth of the front bedroom, Valerie walked softly through the quiet house. She found Gideon sitting alone on the timber porch. Above him stretched a vast, breathtaking canopy of 1,000,000 glittering stars, scattered like diamond dust across the black sky. Gideon held a heavy Winchester rifle across his thick, powerful thighs. He was methodically oiling the iron barrel, moving with a deliberate, chilling calm. The metallic clicks of the weapon echoed sharply in the quiet night. He was not packing his bags. He was not preparing to flee. The towering cattle foreman was preparing for a siege. Valerie stepped out onto the porch, her massive frame filling the doorway. The cold night wind caught the edges of her faded red dress, chilling the thick muscles of her arms, yet she felt entirely numb to the weather. She lowered herself onto the top step beside him, resting her heavy work boots upon the frozen dirt. "You do not need to fight this war," Valerie murmured, her voice thick with a desperate, agonizing sorrow. "The debt belongs to the ghost of my husband. If you stand beside me when the lawmen arrive, they will take this beautiful ranch, they will lock you in chains, or they will leave you bleeding in the dust. I cannot allow you to lose your sanctuary because of my broken past." Gideon paused his work. He rested his calloused hands upon the cold iron of the rifle. He looked out across the dark, rolling hills, his sharp eyes reflecting the starlight. The stoic, unshakable mask he wore for the world slowly slipped away, revealing the deep, roaring ocean of emotion he kept hidden beneath his ribs. 3 years ago, I sat on this exact porch and watched a blizzard swallow the valley, Gideon breathed, his deep voice trembling with the heavy weight of absolute emotional redemption. I held the cold hands of my wife, and I listened to the failing breath of my child. I possessed all the strength of a mountain, yet I could not fight the winter. I was entirely powerless. I buried them on the ridge, and I promised the earth I would never feel that useless again. He turned his weathered, sun-bronzed face toward Valerie. He looked at her heavily muscled arms, her strong, resolute face, and the immense, beautiful courage she carried within her battered soul. "You are not a burden," Gideon stated quietly, the fierce intensity in his gaze stripping away the last remnants of her fear. "You and the boy brought the sun back into this empty house. You brought life back to these timber walls. The men riding from the capital do not frighten me. I will stand on this porch and I will burn the entire world down to the ashes before I let anyone take you or your son away from me." The quiet confession struck Valerie with the force of a falling timber. Her breath caught painfully in her throat. The fierce attachment she felt for this giant silent protector expanded violently, blooming into an undeniable bone-deep longing. She had spent her entire life surviving alone, fighting the cruelty of the world with raw physical power. No one had ever looked at her massive stature and seen a woman worthy of profound, unconditional protection. No one had ever chosen her. She loved him. The realization washed over her like a warm, terrifying tide. She loved the rugged lines of his face, the quiet honor in his heart, and the unshakable safety of his presence. She reached out, her thick fingers trembling as they gently brushed against the rough canvas of his heavy coat. Gideon closed his eyes, leaning into her touch with a desperate, silent reverence, finding his own salvation in the strength of her hands. They sat together in the starlight, bound by a profound, unspoken devotion. Yet, as the hour grew late and Gideon finally retired to his room, the agonizing truth settled heavily upon the shoulders of the giant woman. Her love for him was exactly what made her presence so incredibly dangerous. If she stayed, the marshals would destroy him. She stood alone in the dark kitchen, staring at her small canvas bag resting beside the door. Will she slip away in the dead of night to spare him the wrath of the corrupt lawmen? The heavy clock in the timber hallway struck two deep, echoing chimes, marking the darkest hour of the night. Valerie stood in the absolute stillness of the front bedroom. She possessed the monumental physical strength to tear iron chains apart, yet lifting her small canvas bag from the wooden floor required every ounce of willpower remaining in her massive frame. She looked down at the sleeping form of her son. Little Leo breathed softly in the center of the bed, completely unaware of the agonizing sacrifice his mother was about to make. The corrupt lawmen from the territorial capital would arrive by sunrise. If Valerie remained upon the property, those ruthless men would bring fire and ruin down upon the quiet sanctuary of the valley. She loved the silent protector entirely too much to allow the broken pieces of her past to destroy the beautiful home he had built. She bundled Leo gently into a thick wool blanket, lifting the sleeping child against her broad chest as if he weighed absolutely nothing at all. She slung the rough canvas bag over her powerful, heavily muscled shoulder. Moving with a silent, deliberate grace, she walked down the corridor. She passed the heavy oak door that held the ghost of the past, a room that had once represented impenetrable grief but now symbolized their profound shared healing. Every step she took away from the warmth of the hearth felt like stepping barefoot upon shattered glass. The agonizing fear of loss warred violently against the deep, undeniable longing blooming inside her chest. She reached the front door and pushed the heavy timber outward. The freezing night wind immediately washed over her resolute face. She stepped onto the porch, hoping to slip away into the shadows of the foothills. Gideon stood at the bottom of the wooden steps. He had not gone to sleep. He wore his heavy work coat, his broad shoulders braced against the freezing wind. The Winchester rifle rested against the porch railing. He looked up at the towering woman, his sharp, observant eyes entirely fixed upon the canvas bag slung across her massive shoulder. The stoic, unshakable mask he wore for the harsh frontier world finally fractured. His quiet composure shattered completely under the immense, suffocating weight of an impending heartbreak. "Where do you think you're going?" Gideon asked quietly, his deep voice trembling with a raw, bleeding desperation that pierced through the howling wind. "I am leaving," Valerie murmured, forcing her gravelly voice to remain steady despite the violent storm breaking inside her own heart. "I must walk into the mountains. I must take my son far away from this valley before the dawn breaks. The corrupt marshals are coming for the debts of my late husband, and I will not allow them to burn this beautiful home. You have given me dignity, and you have saved the life of my child. I will not repay your kindness by bringing a war to your doorstep." Gideon climbed the wooden steps slowly. His heavy boots thudded against the timber. He did not look at the canvas bag. He looked directly into the beautiful, tear-streaked face of the giant woman standing before him. He stepped so close that the profound warmth of his massive chest radiated against her chilled skin. "I told you I would burn the entire world down to keep you safe," Gideon breathed, raising his large, calloused hands. He gently gripped the thick, corded muscles of her upper arms, holding her with a fierce, trembling reverence. Did you think those were empty words? Did you think I would simply stand here and let you walk into the freezing darkness alone? You cannot fight 20 federal guns, Valerie pleaded, a heavy sob finally tearing through her throat. The imposing, towering giant of a woman wept freely, the hot tears tracking through the dust upon her cheeks. They will kill you. I cannot survive the guilt of watching you fall. I love you too much to let you die for my past. The quiet confession hung in the freezing air, beautiful and devastating. Gideon felt his heart stop. The deep, agonizing sorrow he had carried for 3 long years suddenly vanished, completely burned away by the raw, fiery truth in her voice. I survived a winter that took everything from me, Gideon whispered, his thick beard brushing against her forehead as he pulled her towering frame into a fierce, desperate embrace. I survived the absolute emptiness of this house, but I will not survive losing you. Do not ask me to endure that silence again. I am begging you, stay with me. Valerie dropped the canvas bag. The heavy fabric struck the wooden floorboards with a dull thud. She wrapped her massive, heavily developed arms around the broad shoulders of the cattle foreman, burying her face into the rough collar of his coat. She held on to him with a desperate, monumental strength, sobbing against his chest while his calloused hands gently stroked her long, slightly messy blonde hair. The agonizing fear of loss finally surrendered to the undeniable power of their shared longing. They clung to one another in the freezing night, 2 broken giants forging an unbreakable bond upon the very edge of disaster. They remained on the porch together until the stars began to fade into a pale gray morning. The wind died down, leaving an eerie, suffocating stillness over the Golden Valley. Then, a low rumble vibrated through the earth. Valerie opened her eyes, turning her gaze toward the eastern horizon. The dawn light cast long, bloody streaks across the sky. At the edge of the rolling hills, a thick cloud of prairie dust rose into the air, steadily advancing toward the isolated ranch, as dust rises on the horizon, signaling the arrival of the corrupt marshals. Will they run, or will they stand and fight for the family they have just built? The morning sun crested the jagged peaks, casting a harsh, blinding light over the Golden Valley as the heavy column of riders finally reached the edge of the property. 20 federal marshals, heavily armed and coated in thick prairie dust, halted their exhausted horses near the sturdy wooden corrals. At the front of the pack rode the cruel debt collector, his silver teeth gleaming in a wicked, triumphant smile. He looked up at the timber porch, entirely expecting to see a terrified, broken woman offering up her weeping child in exchange for mercy. Instead, he found an impenetrable fortress. Valerie stood tall upon the wooden boards, her towering, wildly muscular frame radiating absolute, unyielding defiance. She did not tremble. She did not hide. She wore her simple, faded red dress like heavy armor. She stood shoulder to shoulder with Gideon, their hands tightly locked together. The giant cattle foreman looked down at the armed men with sharp, observant eyes, entirely devoid of fear. His broad shoulders blocked the doorway, shielding the sleeping boy inside. "Bring the child out, Valerie," the debt collector sneered, pulling the federal writ from his wool coat and waving it in the morning air. "Or we will tear this beautiful house apart timber by timber to find him." Gideon did not reach for the heavy Winchester rifle resting against the railing. Bloodshed would only bring more lawmen to the valley, and he absolutely refused to build his new family upon a foundation of violence. Moving with deliberate, heavy grace, he reached inside his thick canvas coat. He withdrew a heavy iron lockbox, the very same box he had retrieved from the shadowed room at the end of the hall. He stepped down the wooden stairs, his massive boots thudding against the dirt until he stood directly before the lead marshal. He opened the heavy iron lid. Inside rested a fortune in solid gold coins and the absolute official territorial deeds to the sprawling ranch. "The legal debt is $3,000, Gideon rumbled, his deep voice carrying the unshakable heavy weight of a mountain. "There is $5,000 in pure gold inside this box. The federal bank will consider the account closed, the bounty is satisfied, and this cruel man will never step foot inside this territory again."
The lead marshal, a weathered man with a silver star pinned to his leather vest, looked down at the gleaming gold, then up at the towering foreman. He reached down from his saddle, accepting the heavy box with a slow nod of profound respect.
The debt is paid in full,
The marshal declared firmly, turning a hard, unforgiving glare upon the furious collector. You have your money. The writ is officially dissolved. Ride back to the capital immediately, or I will arrest you for trespassing on private land. The cruel man sputtered in pure outrage, his face turning a violent shade of red, completely humiliated for a second time. But the federal marshals had their payment, and they immediately turned their horses around. The collector had absolutely no choice but to follow them, disappearing back into the prairie dust, forever banished from their lives. Valerie watched the riders vanish over the horizon. The suffocating, terrible weight she had carried for years suddenly lifted, leaving her entirely breathless. Gideon walked slowly back up the wooden steps. He did not look at the empty space where his gold used to be. He looked only at the beautiful, resolute face of the towering woman he fiercely loved. You gave away your entire fortune, Valerie whispered, her heavy, calloused hands reaching out to gently touch his thick beard. I purchased peace, Gideon murmured gently, pulling her massive frame into a deep, profound embrace. And peace is exactly what we will build here. Little Leo, wearing an oversized wool shirt, pushed the heavy front door open. He rubbed his sleepy eyes, looking up at the two towering figures embracing on the porch. Gideon released Valerie just enough to reach down and scoop the boy into his massive arms. The silent protector kissed the top of the child's head, completely surrendering to the immense joy of the family he had finally claimed. Valerie wrapped her heavily muscled arms around them both, burying her face into Gideon's broad shoulder. The ranch was no longer a lonely fortress. It was a home filled with the warmth of a profound, earned belonging. My friends, as the warm embers of our campfire slowly fade into the dark night, I want you to sit quietly and remember the true nature of strength. We live in a harsh, demanding world that constantly tells us to harden our wounded hearts, to build thick emotional walls, and to rely solely upon the physical muscle on our bones to survive the storm. Valerie possessed the monumental physical power to break mountains and tame wild horses, yet her true, absolute strength was found in the quiet, terrifying courage it took to open her battered heart to a silent protector. She learned that true dignity is never found on a cruel auction block, but in the unwavering respect of a good man who chooses to stand by your side when the world turns against you. Gideon learned that the deepest grief cannot be cured by locking a wooden door and hiding in the dark, but by allowing a new, beautiful love to cross the threshold. They did not just survive the harsh frontier, they built a beautiful, thriving legacy upon it. Little Leo grew into a strong, honorable man, raised by a father who taught him that true manhood is defined by gentleness, honesty, and unwavering loyalty. Valerie never had to hide her massive stature or apologize for her incredible strength ever again, because she was fiercely loved exactly as she was. They lived out their days in that golden valley, their joyous laughter filling the once empty timber halls, proving to the entire world that broken roots can always grow into a magnificent, unshakable tree. Thank you for sitting with me tonight. Thank you for listening to this memory. May you always find the courage to trust again, and may you never have to face the cold storms of this life alone. This story is a work of fiction designed for entertainment and emotional reflection. The characters, events, and situations are entirely fictional. The narrative is crafted to comply with family-safe PG-rated guidelines, focusing on themes of emotional healing, wholesome romance, and personal dignity. No real individuals, groups, or historical figures are depicted.